Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, into a world shrouded in crepe and silence, a place where the veil between life and death felt remarkably thin. You're about to immerse yourself in Victorian England, a time when death wasn't just an unfortunate event, but a constant, almost tangible presence, meticulously woven into the very fabric of daily existence. Imagine, if you will, living in an era where the average life expectancy for a man hovered around 40 years, and for women it wasn't much better. Child mortality was so heartbreakingly common, you probably wouldn't survive past your 5th birthday. Yeah, it was that kind of party. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake in a Victorian home, perhaps a terraced house in London, or a cozy cottage nestled in the rolling countryside. But as you stir, you notice a peculiar quiet, a hushed reverence that permeates the very air. The curtains, usually drawn back to let in the meager sunlight, are heavy and closed, casting the room in a perpetual twilight. There's a faint, cloying scent not of roses, but something more medicinal, perhaps a blend of carbolic acid and lilies, clinging to the heavy velvet drapes. You listen, and the usual street sounds, the rumble of carriages, the cries of street vendors, seem strangely muted, as if the world outside has lowered its voice in deference. This isn't just a quiet morning. It's the silence of death, a silence you would have learned to recognize from childhood. In this era, death wasn't something hidden away in hospitals or hospices. It was a domestic affair, unfolding right in your own parlor. If a family member fell ill, they would likely pass away in their own bed, surrounded by loved ones. The body would then be laid out, often for days, in the principal reception room of the house, transformed into a makeshift chapel. Imagine trying to catch up on your correspondence or read a novel with a deceased relative just a few feet away, perhaps draped in white, perhaps with coins on their eyes. It was a stark reality, one that ensured death was not an abstract concept, but a deeply personal, ever-present specter. You couldn't escape it. It was literally in your living room. As you venture out, the world outside your door offers no respite from this pervasive gloom. You step onto the cobbled street, and the first thing you notice is the sheer volume of black. Women, men, children, everyone, it seems, is dressed in some shade of somber attire. A woman passes, her face obscured by a heavy crepe veil, her rustling skirts a symphony of mourning fabric. A gentleman tips his black hat, a band of black crepe circling its crown. Even the delivery boy, whistling a jaunty tune, wears a black armband. You might think, wow, someone must have died. And you'd be right, but the scale of it, the constant scale of it, would be overwhelming to your modern sensibilities. It wasn't just one funeral. It was the backdrop of life. The sight of a passing funeral procession would be a daily occurrence, sometimes multiple times a day. You'd hear the slow, mournful toll of church bells, a sound that would become as familiar as the chirping of sparrows. The hearse, often an ornate, horse-drawn carriage draped in black plumes and velvet, would glide by, followed by a long line of mourners, their faces grim, their footsteps heavy. You'd instinctively pause, perhaps cross yourself if you were religious, and wait respectfully for the procession to pass. To do otherwise would be a grave social faux pas, a sign of disrespect that could ostracize you from your community. Your social calendar wasn't just filled with tea parties and church services, but also, a lot of funerals. It was the original networking event. If you think about it, though perhaps not the most cheerful one. This constant exposure to death was largely due to the harsh realities of Victorian life. Diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, and typhoid swept through cities with terrifying regularity, often claiming entire families. Sanitation was primitive, medical knowledge rudimentary, and public health initiatives were still in their infancy. Historians still debate whether this ubiquitous presence of death led to a more profound acceptance of mortality or simply a heightened anxiety around it. But what's undeniable is its visible impact. You couldn't turn a corner without being reminded of life's fragility. Even the objects in your home would whisper of mortality. You might pick up a delicate porcelain teacup and notice a small, hand-painted sprig of rosemary, a traditional symbol of remembrance. Or perhaps you'd glance at the wall and see a framed lock of hair, intricately braided, belonging to a departed loved one. Memento mori, remember you must die, wasn't just a philosophical concept. It was embedded in the very decor. You might even own a small, beautifully crafted miniature coffin, not for burial, but as a symbolic reminder of death's inevitability. It sounds a bit morbid to us now, like having a tiny skull on your desk, but for them it was a normal, even comforting way to keep the deceased close. Imagine trying to explain that to your minimalist friends today. Oh, this is just my grandma's hair in a brooch. Super chic, right? The public spectacle of death was not merely a reflection of high mortality rates. It was a deeply ingrained social performance. Every detail, from the width of the black border on your stationery to the type of flowers in a funeral wreath, conveyed precise messages about your grief, your social standing, and your relationship to the deceased. It was a complex, unspoken language that you were expected to understand and participate in flawlessly. To stumble, to wear the wrong shade of black at the wrong time, or to appear insufficiently sorrowful could invite devastating social censure. You were not just grieving. You were performing grief for an audience that was constantly evaluating your sincerity and adherence to tradition. It was the original social media, but with much higher stakes and no delete button. Consider the atmosphere. The pervasive quiet, the constant sight of mourning attire, the frequent sound of church bells, the lingering scent of funeral flowers and disinfectants. This was your everyday reality. Death wasn't just a moment of sorrow. It was a meticulously choreographed spectacle that shaped every aspect of life, from your wardrobe to your social interactions, from the layout of your home to the very air you breathed. You lived under the shadow of grief, a shadow that stretched long and wide over the entire Victorian age. You've just glimpsed the stage, set and draped in shadow, where death wasn't merely an ending, but a meticulously choreographed spectacle. Now, let's pull back the velvet curtain a little further and introduce the principal player, the one whose personal tragedy would cast the longest, darkest shadow over the entire Victorian age, shaping the very air you breathed and the clothes you wore when grief inevitably called. We're talking, of course, about Queen Victoria herself. Imagine, for a moment, the world of 1861. You're going about your daily life, perhaps tending to your shop, or managing your household, or even just attempting to hail one of those newfangled hansom cabs. The British Empire, under Queen Victoria's reign, is at its zenith, a global colossus. And at the heart of this colossal empire sits a relatively young monarch, still very much in love with her husband, Prince Albert. He wasn't just a consort. He was her beloved partner, her closest advisor, the steady hand guiding her through the complexities of state, and, frankly, the brains behind a good many of the progressive reforms of the era. He was, by all accounts, a man of immense intellect, tireless dedication, and, let's be honest, probably a bit of a stick in the mud, but a very effective one. Then, on December 14th, 1861, the unthinkable happened. Prince Albert died. He was only 42 years old. The official cause was typhoid fever, though the Queen, in her overwhelming grief, would forever believe he had simply wasted away from worry over their wayward eldest son, the future Edward VII. This wasn't just a personal tragedy for the Queen. It was a seismic event that reverberated through every corner of British society. You would have felt the shockwaves, a collective gasp of disbelief and sorrow that swept across the nation. It was as if the very sun had dimmed. But what truly transformed the landscape of Victorian mourning wasn't just Albert's death itself, but Queen Victoria's reaction to it. Her grief was not private. It was a profound, public, and utterly unwavering commitment to sorrow that would last for the rest of her incredibly long life. She became the living embodiment of national mourning, a figure shrouded in perpetual black, a stark, unyielding silhouette against the vibrant, if sometimes grimy, backdrop of 19th century London. From that day forward, Queen Victoria would wear black for the remaining 40 years of her reign. Think about that for a moment. For decades, imagine deciding in your early 40s that you were done with color, done with anything but the deepest, most somber hues. It's like someone today deciding, you know what? From now on, it's just sweatpants and a perpetually mournful expression for me. But, make it royal sweatpants and an expression that commanded an empire. Her devotion to Albert, even in death, was absolute and, frankly, a little intense. She ordered that his rooms at Osborne House, their beloved Isle of Wight retreat, be kept exactly as they were when he was alive. Every morning, his shaving water would be brought, fresh and warm, to his dressing room. His clothes were laid out daily, as if he might just walk in and put them on. You can almost smell the faint scent of old leather and dust in those undisturbed chambers, a poignant, almost ghostly tableau of enduring love. This wasn't just a quirky tidbit of royal eccentricity. It was a very public, if unspoken, testament to her unending sorrow, broadcast through the court and, by extension, to the nation. This wasn't just a personal choice. It became a powerful, almost inescapable directive. The Queen was the ultimate trendsetter, the supreme arbiter of taste and morality. And when the Queen decided that the proper way to grieve was with such unwavering, visible devotion, the rest of society felt compelled to follow. It wasn't just about fashion. It was about demonstrating loyalty, respect, and a proper sense of moral rectitude. If the Queen, the very symbol of the nation, could dedicate her life to mourning, then surely you, a mere subject, could at least manage a year or two of dedicated somberness. This royal precedent elevated mourning from a private sorrow to a public performance, a social obligation that permeated every layer of society. You would have felt the immense pressure. Imagine attending a social gathering, even a small tea, and seeing someone in anything other than appropriate mourning attire after a recent loss. It would be scandalous. It would be seen as a profound disrespect, a lack of feeling, almost an insult to the Queen herself, whose example was so clear. Historians still argue whether Victoria's prolonged grief was genuinely pathological, a form of deep depression, or if it was, at least in part, a shrewd political maneuver to solidify the monarchy's moral standing in a rapidly changing world. By embracing such profound sorrow, she presented herself as the epitome of Victorian domestic virtue, the devoted wife, the grieving widow, the moral compass. Regardless of the exact balance between genuine emotion and strategic performance, the effect was undeniable. Her grief became the blueprint for respectable grief across the empire. Because the Queen was so visibly, perpetually in mourning, it legitimized and even glorified the act of grieving. It made it not just acceptable, but expected to dedicate significant time and resources to the outward display of sorrow. You weren't just sad. You were performing your sadness for society, following the lead of the highest figure in the land. This royal endorsement transformed mourning into an elaborate, almost theatrical ritual, complete with its own strict rules, costumes, and props. It became an inescapable part of life, a social script you were compelled to memorize and perform with meticulous accuracy. So, as you step further into this world, remember that the heavy weight of those black fabrics, the solemnity of the rituals, and the sheer length of the mourning periods you would be expected to observe, all stemmed from the profound personal grief of one powerful woman. Her sorrow, amplified by her position, became the very foundation upon which the entire edifice of Victorian mourning practices was built. You weren't just grieving for your loved one. In a very real sense, you were grieving alongside your Queen, and that, in Victorian society, was a powerful, binding force. You awaken, not to the gentle chirping of modern birds outside your window, but to the hushed, almost reverent stillness of a Victorian morning. The air feels heavy, not just with the promise of a new day, but with the profound, inescapable weight of recent loss. And as you rise, your gaze falls upon the garments laid out for you, a stark, unyielding silhouette against the dim light. This, my dear listener, is your uniform for the next year and a day. The deepest widow's weeds. Imagine, for a moment, shedding your softest pajamas, your most comfortable loungewear, and instead, preparing to encase yourself in what feels less like clothing and more like a visible physical declaration to the entire world that you are unequivocally heartbroken. This isn't just black. Oh no, this is mourning black. It's a color so absolute, so devoid of light, It practically swallows the very air around you. Your first encounter is with the fabric itself. Forget luxurious silks or comforting cottons. You are to be swathed in materials like bombazine, a twilled fabric of silk and worsted wool, or more commonly, crepe. Now, crepe, or crepe as we often spell it today, wasn't the flowy, elegant fabric you might associate with modern evening gowns. Victorian mourning crepe was a dense, crinkled, dull textile, specifically treated to absorb light rather than reflect it. It had a peculiar, almost papery stiffness. Run your fingers over it. Feels unyielding. It rustles with a dry, whispery sound, a constant, subtle reminder of your state. It clings and chafes in all the least comfortable places, a constant, itchy penance against your skin. Imagine your favorite comfy yoga pants, but instead, they're made of what feels like industrial-grade window screening, dyed the color of a moonless night, and designed to make you sweat profusely. Oh, the glamour! The dress itself is a masterpiece of purposeful severity. High-necked, long-sleeved, and floor-length, it leaves not an inch of skin exposed save for your face and hands, and even those will soon be obscured. There are no ruffles, no lace, no bows, no embellishments whatsoever. No glimmer of sparkle, no hint of color, no decorative stitching. The silhouette is deliberately plain, almost architectural in its simplicity, designed to convey a singular message: profound sorrow. This isn't about fashion. It's about anti-fashion, a deliberate erasure of vanity and personal expression in favor of a universal symbol of grief. It's like the ultimate "don't talk to me, I'm sad" t-shirt, except it covered you from head to toe and lasted a year, and you couldn't even take it off when you got home, because someone might pop in. But the most iconic, and perhaps most physically restrictive, element of your deepest widow's weeds is the crepe bonnet and veil. The bonnet, often simple and unadorned, frames your face, but it's the veil that truly sets you apart. This isn't a delicate wisp of tulle. No, this is a thick, opaque cascade of crepe, sometimes 2 or even 3 layers, that falls from your bonnet, completely obscuring your face from public view. When you step outside, this veil becomes your shield, your prison, and your unmistakable identifier. It's a literal barrier between you and the world, a heavy curtain that muffles sounds, restricts your peripheral vision, and traps heat around your face. Trying to cross the street in a thick crepe veil was probably an extreme sport in itself, akin to navigating a busy intersection with a pillowcase over your head. Good luck seeing that rogue horse-drawn carriage. Every accessory, too, adheres to this strict monochrome. Your gloves are black, simple, and unadorned. Your shoes are black, plain, and low-heeled. Any jewelry you wear must be equally somber. Jet, a form of fossilized wood polished to a deep, lusterless black, is the only acceptable adornment. No sparkling diamonds, no gleaming gold, no colorful gemstones. Even the buttons on your dress are covered in crepe or made of jet. You are, in essence, a walking, breathing embodiment of negation, a void of color and light. The physical discomfort of these garments is considerable. The crepe, as mentioned, is notoriously scratchy and unyielding. In the summer months, the heavy black fabric, designed to absorb heat, would have been oppressive, turning your body into a personal sauna. The restrictive nature of the high necklines and tight bodices, combined with the sheer weight of the fabric, would have made movement cumbersome and breathing occasionally difficult. Imagine trying to perform daily chores, or even just sit comfortably, while feeling constantly trussed up and overheated. This wasn't merely a symbol. It was a constant, physical reminder of your bereavement. But beyond the physical discomfort lies the profound psychological impact. Donning these weeds each morning is a daily, ritualistic act of recommitting to your grief. You cannot escape it. It is literally woven into the fabric of your day. Every reflection you catch, every glance from a passerby, reinforces your status as a grieving widow. There's no hiding your sorrow, no pretending to be fine. Your clothes scream your loss louder than any words ever could. It's a public performance of grief, a visible assurance to society that you are indeed suffering, and doing so appropriately. This period of first mourning was incredibly strict and, for a widow, lasted a full year and a day. During this time, you were expected to remain largely secluded, avoiding social gatherings, entertainment, and even certain public spaces. Your crepe-shrouded appearance served as a warning to others. Approach with caution, speak in hushed tones, and certainly do not offer any frivolous conversation. It was a social force field, politely but firmly keeping the world at arm's length. Historians still debate whether the sheer impracticality and discomfort of these garments were intentional, designed to keep grieving women isolated and focused solely on their sorrow, or merely an unfortunate side effect of the available technology and fashion trends. Regardless, the effect was profound. Your appearance dictated your social interactions, your activities, and even your emotional expression. To deviate from these sartorial rules was to risk social ostracization, to be seen as disrespectful to the deceased, or, worse, as lacking in proper feminine sensibility. And the maintenance. Crepe was so delicate and unyielding that cleaning it was practically an act of war against the fabric itself. Most women simply replaced pieces as they became soiled, adding another layer to the financial burden of grief. Imagine the sheer logistics of maintaining an entire wardrobe of this finicky, light-absorbing textile for over a year. It was a full-time commitment, a constant battle against dust and grime on the very symbol of your sorrow. So, as you stand there, fully encased in your deepest widow's weeds, you are not merely dressed. You are transformed. You are a living monument to your loss, a walking testament to the rigid, all-encompassing power of Victorian mourning. Every thread, every dull fold, every uncomfortable itch is a part of this profound, year-long declaration of sorrow. There is no escaping the shadow you cast, for you are the shadow. You've spent what feels like an eternity shrouded in the deep, unyielding void of first mourning. Every stitch of your crepe-draped existence has screamed your sorrow to the world, a heavy, visible declaration of loss that permitted no escape. But now, as the prescribed period for that absolute desolation begins to wane, typically a year and a day for a widow, though the exact duration could vary depending on the relationship and social standing, a fascinatingly precise calendar of grief, you find yourself on the precipice of a subtle yet profoundly significant shift. You are about to enter the phase known as second mourning. Imagine for a moment the sheer physical relief. That scratchy, light-absorbing crepe, which felt as if it were constantly trying to pull you into a black hole of despair, is slowly, ever so slowly, allowed to recede. It's not a sudden, dramatic unveiling, mind you. This is Victorian society, after all, where even your wardrobe changes are choreographed with the precision of a Swiss clock, if that clock were made entirely of sorrow and social expectations. You're not suddenly rocking pastels and polka dots. Oh no, that would be scandalous. Instead, you're permitted to transition to fabrics that, while still emphatically black, possess a hint of texture, a whisper of sheen, a subtle richness that was previously forbidden. Think of it as moving from the matte black phase to the satin black phase. Your dresses might now be fashioned from silk, velvet, or even a very fine, lustrous wool. The dull, dead quality of the crepe is replaced by materials that catch the light, offering a glimmer of depth. You might find yourself running your fingers over the soft pile of a velvet cuff, or appreciating the subtle rustle of a heavy silk skirt as you move. It's a quiet rebellion of the senses, a tiny, almost imperceptible nod to the idea that life, in some form, might eventually, hesitantly continue. It's like upgrading your basic black t-shirt to a cashmere blend. Still black, but oh, so much nicer to touch. And with these new textures come the first, cautious whispers of embellishment. Remember how first mourning dictated only dull jet or black onyx for jewelry, and absolutely no adornment on your clothing? Well, in second mourning, the rules slightly loosen their iron grip. You can now incorporate more elaborate jet jewelry, perhaps a larger brooch, a more intricate necklace, or even earrings that dangle with a bit more flourish. Black lace, previously reserved for the very edges of bonnets or veils, can now appear as trimmings on your bodice or sleeves, adding a delicate, almost ethereal quality to your somber attire. You might even see subtle black ribbons, woven into your hair or used as decorative accents on your dress. It's still black on black, but now with a dash of pizzazz. If pizzazz meant barely noticeable texture. This gradual softening of your attire wasn't just about comfort. It was a carefully observed social signal. Your clothing was a public thermometer of your grief. As the textures softened and the embellishments appeared, you were signaling to your community that you were progressing through the stages of mourning in the proper manner. There was an unspoken expectation that you would follow these rules to the letter, lest you be accused of disrespecting the deceased or, even worse, enjoying yourself too much. Historians still argue whether these minute distinctions were truly about emotional processing or simply another layer of social control, a way to visually map out who was suffering just enough for public consumption. Consider the complexity of this wardrobe transition. It wasn't just one outfit. You'd likely have a whole new set of dresses, bonnets, shawls, and accessories specifically for this phase. The booming industry of mourning wear, which we'll delve into later, was more than happy to supply your every somber need. Imagine the scene in a shop. Yes, I need a silk dress for second mourning, perhaps with a touch of chantilly lace, but definitely no broderie anglaise. That's far too cheerful, darling. It was an exhausting, expensive, and incredibly detailed process. You might even, if you were of a certain social standing, have a dedicated mourning dressmaker who specialized in these subtle shifts, guiding you through the labyrinthine rules of appropriate grief attire. This phase of second mourning could last for several months, often another 9 months for a widow, bringing the total mourning period to nearly 2 years. For other relationships, like mourning a parent or sibling, the first mourning period would be shorter, and thus the second mourning period would adjust accordingly. The key was the gradual, almost imperceptible shift. You're not suddenly wearing a sparkling tiara, you're just allowed a slightly shinier black button. It's like being allowed to add a single, very dark gray pixel to an entirely black screen. A true fashion revolution. One particularly quirky tidbit from this period is the use of crepe-trimmed silk or silk crepe during the very early stages of second mourning. This wasn't the dull, heavy crepe of first mourning, but a silk fabric woven to mimic the texture of crepe, or silk dresses that were still trimmed with the more somber crepe. It was a visual bridge, a way to slowly wean you off the most severe fabric while still maintaining a somber connection. It's like when you're trying to cut down on sugar, so you switch from a full sugar soda to a diet soda, even though you still know it's soda. Still technically mourning, but with a little less guilt. During this time, you might also be permitted to wear a wider variety of black accessories. Your bonnet, while still black and perhaps still featuring a veil, might be made of a softer, more luxurious fabric. Your gloves, still black, could be made of fine kid leather rather than dull cotton. The subtle differences would be clear to any observant Victorian eye, broadcasting your slow, cautious journey back towards the land of the living, albeit still with a heavy heart and a wardrobe that screamed, "I'm still sad, but I'm getting there, eventually." Think of the mental toll this must have taken. Not only were you grappling with profound personal loss, but you were also constantly performing your grief for society. Every outfit change, every accessory choice was a public statement. It was a time when your personal sorrow was meticulously categorized, judged, and displayed. The slow transition of second mourning was a testament to the Victorian belief that grief was not a private, internal process, but a public, social duty, meticulously regulated down to the very fabric on your back. It's enough to make you want to just stay in your pajamas forever, isn't it? You've navigated the treacherous waters of first mourning, that initial, suffocating plunge into the deepest, unyielding black. You've endured the year, perhaps even 2, wrapped head to toe in crepe, feeling as though the very light of the world had been absorbed by your somber attire. Then came second mourning, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift where the harsh crepe might give way to duller silks, and perhaps a touch of jet beadwork or some matte embroidery could appear. But even then, the core remained black, black, black. You felt like a walking shadow, a visible monument to loss, your very presence a reminder to all of the fragility of life and the iron grip of societal expectation. Now, though, a faint, almost imperceptible glimmer of light begins to penetrate the oppressive darkness. You feel it less as a sudden burst and more like the slow, hesitant dawn after an interminable night. This, my dear listener, is your entry into what Victorians termed half-mourning. Imagine the quiet, almost reverent anticipation as you contemplate a wardrobe that isn't entirely devoid of color. It's not like you're suddenly pulling out a rainbow-striped sundress. Heavens no. That would cause a scandal so profound it would echo through the drawing rooms for weeks. Instead, you're granted permission to introduce specific, muted hues into your sartorial repertoire. A subtle signal that while your grief endures, its sharpest edges have, perhaps, begun to soften. The palette of half-mourning is surprisingly specific, almost like a secret code only the initiated could truly decipher. You wouldn't just grab any gray or any purple. Oh no, that would be far too simple. Instead, you would be looking for shades like dove gray, slate gray, or perhaps a soft, almost ethereal silver gray. For purples, think deep, rich lavenders, mauves, lilacs, or even a somber plum. Sometimes, if you were really pushing the boundaries, you might introduce a dark, almost charcoal green or a deep midnight blue, but these were often considered quite daring, almost rebellious, for the initial stages of half-mourning. It's as if society was saying, okay, you can have color, but make it look like the color itself is also a little bit sad. You can almost hear the sigh of relief from the mourner. Oh, thank goodness. A shade of purple that accurately reflects my lingering sorrow mixed with a tiny bit of hope. It's a delicate balance, indeed. The fabrics themselves also undergo a transformation. Gone, or at least significantly reduced, is the heavy, light-absorbing crepe. In its place, you might find yourself draped in lighter silks, soft wools, or even some fine cottons. The textures would be less stark, perhaps a little more yielding to the touch. You might even discover the joy of a subtle pattern, a tiny stripe, a discreet damask, or a delicate floral motif woven into the fabric, provided the colors remained within the approved somber spectrum. Imagine the sheer luxury of wearing a dress that doesn't feel like it's actively trying to absorb your soul. A dress that might, just might, allow a stray shaft of sunlight to reflect off its surface. It's the small victories, isn't it? This transition wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a deeply symbolic and highly anticipated societal event. Your re-entry into society was meticulously observed, almost like a performance review. Everyone, from your closest relatives to your most distant acquaintances, would be watching, assessing, and, if we're being honest, probably gossiping about your choices. Did you lighten your palette too soon? Was that particular shade of lavender perhaps a touch too cheerful for only a year and a half after your husband's passing? The pressure was immense. It was a clear signal to the world that you were gradually, cautiously, beginning to emerge from the deepest chasm of your grief and were ready to tentatively re-engage with the social sphere. You weren't expected to attend balls or grand soirees just yet, but perhaps a quiet tea, a visit to a close friend, or a subdued promenade in the park. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this rigid adherence to mourning protocols is the sheer length of time these phases were expected to last. For a widow, full mourning, deepest black, typically lasted a year and a day. Second mourning, still black, but with some minor embellishments, could last another 9 months. And then, half mourning, with its subtle introduction of grays and lavenders, was generally observed for another 6 months to a year. This meant that a woman could easily spend 2 to 2.5 years, or even longer, in some form of prescribed mourning attire after the death of her husband. That's a significant portion of a person's life, especially when you consider that the average lifespan was considerably shorter than it is today. Imagine planning your social calendar around a 3-year wardrobe cycle dictated by the Grim Reaper. It makes modern fashion trends seem positively fleeting by comparison. The psychological impact of this slow, deliberate shedding of black was profound. For you, the mourner, it was a tangible marker of time passing, of the world continuing to turn even in the face of your immense personal loss. Each new shade, each lighter fabric, was a small step towards reclaiming a sense of self that had been subsumed by grief. It was a subtle permission slip to breathe a little easier, to feel a little less like a walking memorial. Yet, it was also fraught with anxiety. Had you mourned enough? Would your choices be judged as disrespectful to the deceased? The line between proper decorum and perceived callousness was incredibly thin, and society, with its keen eye and sharp tongue, was always ready to point out any misstep. A quirky tidbit related to half-mourning colors involves the specific popularity of certain shades of purple. Mauve, a synthetic dye first discovered in 1856, became incredibly fashionable, and its muted, almost melancholic quality made it perfectly suited for half-mourning attire. It was a color that managed to be both fashionable and appropriately somber, a subtle nod to modernity within the confines of tradition. So, while you might have felt like a prisoner of convention, at least you could be a fashionable prisoner of convention, draped in the latest chemically engineered sorrow. It almost sounds like a marketing slogan, doesn't it? New Mauve. Because your grief deserves to be on trend. Historians still argue whether the strictness of these mourning rules was truly universal across all social classes or if they were primarily an upper and middle class phenomenon. While the ideals were certainly propagated throughout society, the practicalities of affording multiple mourning wardrobes, often custom-made, would have been a significant burden for working-class families. It's likely that while they adhered to the spirit of mourning, wearing dark colors, avoiding social events, the specific nuances of fabric, embellishment, and precise color transitions might have been less rigidly observed out of sheer economic necessity. After all, it's hard to follow the rules of dove gray versus slate gray when you only own one Sunday best dress, and it's already black because it's practical. As you moved deeper into half-mourning, the subtle shifts continued. Perhaps a delicate lace collar, a small brooch that wasn't jet, or even a very subdued pattern on a scarf. The idea was to gradually reintroduce yourself to the world, not with a bang, but with a whisper. You were still a person who had suffered a great loss, but you were also, slowly but surely, becoming a person who could engage with life again, albeit cautiously. It was a testament to the Victorian belief that grief, while profound, had its proper place and its proper duration, and that society had a vested interest in seeing its members return to their roles, even if those roles were now subtly altered by the shadow of what had been. As you gently drift deeper into this twilight world, you might assume that the intricate, almost theatrical performance of Victorian mourning was solely the domain of women, with their veils and crepe and layers of somber fabric. But oh, how wrong you would be! While the widow's weeds were undeniably the most visually arresting, the shadow of grief stretched far beyond, encompassing every man and even the tiniest child in its dark embrace. You see, in this era, death was a family affair, a collective public declaration, and no one, absolutely no one, was exempt from its sartorial demands. Imagine yourself, a man of the Victorian age, perhaps a successful merchant or a quiet scholar. When loss struck your household, your transformation, though less dramatic than your wife's, was no less rigid. Gone would be your usual tweed jackets or patterned waistcoats. Instead, you would don the uniform of sorrow, a meticulously tailored suit of the deepest, most unforgiving black. This wasn't just any black suit. It was the black suit, worn with a gravity that spoke volumes. Your shirts, too, would shift from crisp white to muted tones, perhaps a dark gray or even a stark black, though white was often permitted for shirts if accompanied by other black accessories. Your ties, once a subtle splash of color or a jaunty pattern, would become plain black silk or, for deeper mourning, black crepe, absorbing all light, all joy. It's almost as if the Victorians believed that if you dressed like a shadow, you might just blend into the background of your own grief, becoming less of a visible target for further misfortune. A somewhat comforting thought, perhaps, if you're the type who likes to hide from your problems. Isn't it? The most universally recognized emblem of male mourning, however, was something you might still occasionally glimpse today, albeit in a more symbolic form: the armband. For men, a simple band of black crepe, worn prominently on the left arm, was a clear and unmistakable signal to the world that you were in mourning. This was particularly common for those not in immediate family, like distant relatives, colleagues, or even servants, allowing them to participate in the public display of grief without committing to a full suit of black. Think of it as the Victorian equivalent of a LinkedIn profile update, instantly communicating your current status without having to explain yourself. Very efficient, if a little morbid. Your hat, too, would be touched by the solemnity. If you wore a top hat, as many gentlemen did, a band of black crepe would be affixed around its crown, a subtle yet potent sign of your sorrow. Even your gloves would be black, and your walking stick might feature a black handle or a black ribbon tied around it. The overall effect for men was one of stoic, unyielding gravity. While women's mourning attire screamed of emotional devastation, men's whispered of quiet, internal suffering, a stiff upper lip approach to heartbreak that was deeply ingrained in the Victorian male psyche. You were expected to be the rock, the anchor, the unmovable object in a sea of grief, and your clothing reflected that expectation. Historians still debate the extent to which this outward stoicism truly reflected internal emotional suppression versus being a genuine cultural expression of male grief. Was it truly felt or simply performed? The answer, like much of Victorian life, probably lies somewhere in the murky middle. Now, let's talk about the littlest mourners, the children. Oh, the children. One can almost hear the collective sigh of parents trying to keep black crepe clean on a perpetually muddy toddler. Even the youngest members of the family were not spared the dictates of mourning fashion. For girls, this meant miniature versions of their mother's somber dresses, though perhaps with less elaborate crepe or fewer layers. Their usual brightly colored ribbons, laces, and embroidery would vanish, replaced by plain dark fabrics, black, dark gray, or deep navy. Imagine a little girl, perhaps no older than 5, dressed head to toe in black, her usually rosy cheeks framed by a dark bonnet, looking like a tiny, solemn phantom. It's heartbreaking to contemplate, isn't it? Boys, too, were dressed in dark, muted colors. Their small suits would mirror their fathers, though often in less formal styles, perhaps with simple collars and fewer adornments. While black was the primary color for deep mourning, dark blues and grays were often introduced sooner for children, perhaps due to the sheer impracticality of keeping an active child immaculately black. Can you imagine the horror of a smudge of mud on your child's pristine mourning suit? The scandal, the sheer audacity of dirt daring to defile the sanctity of grief. It almost makes you want to invent washable fabrics just thinking about it. One quirky tidbit, however, about children's mourning, especially for infants, is that pure white was sometimes permitted, particularly for very young babies. This was less about defying mourning conventions and more about the symbolic purity and innocence associated with infancy, especially if the child itself was the one being mourned. A white christening gown, for example, might serve as a shroud, a poignant blend of new life and sudden loss. But once a child was past infancy and capable of running around, and thus getting dirty, they were firmly placed in the dark palette of mourning. The duration of mourning for children, much like for adults, varied depending on their relationship to the deceased. A child who lost a parent would be expected to wear mourning for a significant period, often a year or more, gradually lightening their attire. Losing a sibling or a grandparent would entail a shorter, though still strict, period. It wasn't just about the clothing. It was about the constant visual reminder, both to the child and to society, of the loss. You were literally wearing your grief on your sleeve, and your entire family was doing it with you. A silent, somber parade of shared sorrow. It's hard to imagine the psychological impact this constant visual cue had on children, forced to carry the weight of their family's grief, not just emotionally, but physically, in their very clothing. It certainly makes your current struggle to get your kids to wear matching socks seem like a walk in the park, doesn't it? So, as you can see, the Victorian era's obsession with mourning dress was an all-encompassing force. From the highest gentleman to the smallest child, everyone played their part in this meticulously choreographed dance of grief, their clothing a silent, yet powerful, testament to loss. It was a world where every stitch, every shade, every fold of fabric communicated a precise message, ensuring that no one could escape the shadow of death or the elaborate rituals designed to honor it. You've donned the requisite black, you've navigated the social minefield of grief, but the Victorians knew that true remembrance wasn't just about what you wore. It was about what you kept. And oh, did they keep things. As you walk through your meticulously decorated Victorian home, every surface, every nook, seems to hold a tangible echo of lives lost, a physical manifestation of love and longing. This is the realm of memento mori, objects designed quite literally to remind you of death, and by extension of the person who has passed on. Forget your digital photo albums. These were the ultimate, deeply personal and sometimes, yes, slightly unsettling souvenirs. Imagine, for a moment, the quiet solemnity of a Victorian parlor. The air is still, perhaps a little dusty, and the light filters softly through heavy curtains. Your gaze falls upon a framed, intricate work of art on the wall. It's not a painting, nor an embroidery, not quite. As you lean closer, a shiver might run down your spine as you realize the delicate, almost lace-like patterns are woven entirely from human hair. Yes, you heard that right. Hair. This wasn't some niche, fringe practice. Hair work, or hair art, was a mainstream, incredibly popular expression of mourning and remembrance throughout the Victorian era. Why hair, you ask? Well, unlike the body itself, hair was seen as an enduring, incorruptible part of a person. It didn't decay. It held the essence of the individual, a literal strand of their being that could be preserved, shaped, and worn close to the heart. It's like the original personal brand, but way more literal and perhaps a little less washable. You might possess a tiny, perfectly coiled ringlet of your lost child's hair, nestled within a locket worn daily around your neck. Or perhaps, after the passing of your beloved spouse, you would commission a master hair artist to transform their locks into an exquisite piece of jewelry. Think rings with intricate braided patterns, brooches adorned with delicate floral designs crafted entirely from hair, or even watch chains for gentlemen, subtly woven with strands of a departed loved one. It was a thriving industry, with specialized artisans who could take a lock of hair and, with tiny tools and immense patience, transform it into something truly breathtaking. They'd often work with gold wire, intricately braiding, knotting, and weaving the hair into miniature sculptures, sometimes even creating tiny, three-dimensional scenes like weeping willows or gravestones. It's a level of dedication to craft that makes your latest DIY project look like child's play. The most elaborate pieces were often framed wreaths or mourning pictures, which could be quite large and incredibly complex. Imagine a Victorian woman, meticulously collecting hair from her entire family over years, then commissioning a piece that depicted a family tree or a detailed landscape, with each tree or flower crafted from the hair of a different family member, living or deceased. It was a beautiful, albeit somewhat macabre, way to keep the family literally woven together, a tangible lineage hanging on the wall. You can almost feel the texture of the hair, stiffened and preserved, under your fingertips. Feels strangely intimate, doesn't it? Like holding a piece of eternity in your hand. But the Victorians didn't stop at hair. The advent of photography in the mid-19th century offered another, perhaps even more direct, way to capture and preserve the image of the deceased. Before photography became widely accessible and affordable, portraits were a luxury, usually reserved for the wealthy. For most families, a loved one's passing might be the only opportunity they ever had to obtain an image of them. This led to the widespread, though now often unsettling, practice of post-mortem photography. You would arrange for a photographer to come to your home, or perhaps take the deceased to a studio. The scene would be carefully staged. The individual, often dressed in their finest clothes, might be posed to appear as if sleeping peacefully in their bed, a serene expression on their face. Sometimes they were propped up in chairs, their eyes either closed or, in some cases, even painted open on the photograph to give the illusion of life. It's a stark contrast to our modern obsession with capturing every waking moment. For Victorians, sometimes the only moment captured was the final one. Whole families would gather for these sittings, standing around the deceased, often with solemn, unsmiling faces. You might see a mother holding her lost infant, or siblings gathered around a younger brother or sister, their expressions a poignant blend of grief and the stoic acceptance of their era. These photographs weren't meant to be hidden away in shame. They were cherished keepsakes, often displayed prominently in parlors or carried in lockets, just like the hair jewelry. They served as a potent reminder of the person, a visual anchor in a world where memories could fade and images were rare. Just imagine trying to get the kids to sit still for a family photo, let alone one where someone isn't breathing. It certainly puts a different spin on, say, cheese. Historians still debate whether the widespread practice of post-mortem photography was primarily a comfort, a cultural obligation, or perhaps even a subtle form of denial of death's finality. For many, it was undeniably a source of immense solace, a tangible connection to a lost loved one in a time of high mortality rates. It offered a unique, enduring image that could be revisited again and again, a way to keep the deceased physically present in the family narrative. There's a particularly quirky tidbit about these practices. Some photographers specialized in making the deceased look as alive as possible, sometimes even using stands or clamps hidden behind clothing to keep the body upright. The goal was to create an illusion, a moment frozen in time where death seemed merely a deep slumber. You might see a slight blurring around the edges of the living family members in these photos, a result of their slight movements during the long exposure times, while the deceased, perfectly still, remains in sharp focus. It's a subtle yet powerful visual cue to the stark difference between the living and the recently departed. So, as you reflect on these intimate mementos, you begin to understand the Victorian relationship with death was far more entwined with life than ours. They didn't just mourn. They preserved. They didn't just remember. They held onto pieces of their loved ones, tangibly, physically, in ways that might seem strange or even morbid to us today. But for them, these objects, the delicate braids of hair, the solemn, unblinking eyes in a photograph, were not macabre. They were simply love made visible, a desperate and tender attempt to bridge the chasm between life and what lay beyond the veil. The air in your home hangs heavy, thick with the scent of lilies and something else, something medicinal, yet strangely sweet. A hushed reverence has settled over every surface, a tangible presence that presses down on your very breath. You've been living in this suspended reality since the moment the breath left your loved one's body. And now, the final, most public act of grief is about to unfold. You are about to witness and participate in the elaborate funerary rites that mark a Victorian farewell, a spectacle meticulously orchestrated from your very doorstep. You stand by the parlor window, draped in your deepest black, watching as the street outside transforms. It's no longer just a thoroughfare. It's a stage, and you are part of the main cast. The first arrivals are the undertakers, or rather, the funeral furnishers as they increasingly preferred to be known. They glide with a practiced solemnity, their dark suits almost merging with the shadows. These aren't just coffin makers anymore. They are the burgeoning architects of grief, managing every single detail, from the preparation of the body to the precise angle of the plumes on the horses' heads. It's quite the career change, isn't it? From humble carpenters to masters of ceremonies for the dearly departed. The coffin itself is brought out first, a polished, often ornate casket that gleams dully in the subdued light. Depending on your family's means, it might be simple pine or elaborately carved oak, perhaps adorned with silver or brass fittings. For a child, it might be stark white, a poignant contrast to the surrounding gloom. You remember the hushed consultations, the choices of lining silk, satin, velvet, as if preparing a final, permanent bed. It's a strange shopping trip, isn't it? Picking out the ultimate outfit for someone who won't be wearing it for long. Then comes the hearse. Oh, the hearse. This is no simple vehicle. It is a grand, theatrical carriage, often black, sometimes white for a child, draped in velvet and adorned with towering plumes, usually black ostrich feathers that sway with a mournful rhythm in the slightest breeze. The number and height of these plumes were a direct indicator of social status and the deceased's standing. More plumes, more prestige, apparently. It's a bit like a Victorian version of Who Has the Biggest Monster Truck, just for funerals. The horses pulling it are magnificent, often black, sometimes draped in custom-made black cloths, their hooves clip-clopping a slow, deliberate rhythm on the cobblestones, a sound that echoes the heavy beat of your own heart. They seem to understand the solemnity of their task, their heads bowed, their powerful bodies moving with an almost unnatural grace. As the coffin is carefully loaded into the hearse, the procession begins to form. This isn't a casual stroll. It's a precisely choreographed march. At the very front, you might see mutes or undertaker's men, often dressed in deep black cloaks and carrying staffs, their faces impassive, their role to embody the silence and sorrow of the occasion. It's a rather peculiar job, isn't it? To be paid to look grim. They are followed by the pallbearers, men of status or close family friends, who would have carried the coffin from the house to the hearse, their faces etched with practiced solemnity. Next come the immediate family, the chief mourners. You find yourself among them, your heavy veil obscuring your face, the crepe stiff against your skin. You walk slowly, deliberately, the pace dictated by the hearse, which moves at a snail's pace, sometimes as slow as a mile an hour. This wasn't just for dramatic effect. It was to ensure everyone could keep up, and to allow the entire neighborhood ample time to witness the display. It was a public declaration of your grief, a visual statement for all to see. The sheer effort of maintaining such a glacial pace while draped in layers of heavy wool and crepe could make even the most stoic Victorian break a sweat, though, of course, you'd never show it. Behind the family, a long line of carriages follows, filled with extended family, friends, and acquaintances, all dressed in their appropriate mourning attire. The length of this procession, like the plumes on the hearse, was another visual marker of the deceased's importance and the family's social standing. It's a bit like a morbid parade, isn't it? One where the floats are carriages and the confetti is, well, tears mostly. The route to the cemetery is often chosen for its visibility, passing through main streets where onlookers can gather and bear witness. This public display was not just about mourning. It was about demonstrating respect, social standing, and adherence to societal norms. It was a way for the community to acknowledge the loss and for the bereaved to show that they were performing their grief correctly. This professionalization of undertaking, which standardized many of these elaborate rituals, truly boomed in the Victorian era, transforming death from a private family affair into a highly organized public spectacle. As you trudge along, the sounds of the city are strangely muted. The clip-clop of hooves, the gentle creak of carriage wheels, the rustle of heavy fabrics, and the occasional muffled sob are the only sounds that truly penetrate the veil of grief. You might catch glimpses of people pausing their daily lives, doffing their hats, or simply watching with solemn expressions from their windows. You are, for this brief journey, the center of their attention, a living embodiment of loss. Historians still argue whether this elaborate performance was primarily an expression of genuine, overwhelming grief or a carefully constructed social obligation designed to uphold appearances and reinforce class distinctions. Perhaps it was a complex blend of both, where the outward display, however performative, provided a necessary structure for processing unimaginable sorrow in an era where death was a constant, intimate companion. Finally, the cemetery gates loom into view, their wrought iron designs a stark, yet beautiful welcome. The air here is often colder, the ground softer, cushioned by grass and the quiet reverence of countless graves. The procession slows even further, and you prepare for the final, heartbreaking ritual at the graveside. The journey itself has been a physical manifestation of your grief, a slow, deliberate walk into a future forever altered. And as the hearse stops, and the pallbearers prepare to lift the coffin one last time, you know the most profound part of the ritual is yet to come. As you navigate the hushed drawing room, the air, thick with the scent of lilies and something vaguely medicinal, carries another, more subtle fragrance. The sweet, earthy perfume of fresh-cut flowers. Your eyes, still a little puffy from weeping, drift towards the arrangements, wreaths, sprays, and delicate posies that adorn every available surface, from the mantelpiece to the coffin itself. You might think they're simply decorative, a splash of beauty against the stark black and muted tones of grief. But in Victorian society, oh no, they are so much more. These aren't just flowers. They are silent messengers, whispering a complex language of love, loss, and remembrance that you, as a proper Victorian, are expected to understand implicitly. This is the era of floriography, or the language of flowers, a deeply ingrained cultural phenomenon that extended far beyond the realm of mere sentimentality. It was a sophisticated, often unspoken, code where every bloom, every leaf, even the way a bouquet was presented or received, conveyed a specific message. And when it came to death, this silent language became profoundly important, a crucial way to express feelings that were often too overwhelming or too private for verbal articulation. Imagine trying to text your deepest sympathies, but instead of emojis, you're sending a meticulously arranged bouquet of carefully chosen blooms. It was like a botanical Morse code, only much prettier and significantly less likely to get you arrested for espionage. You see a wreath of dark green ivy. its glossy leaves intertwined with sprays of rosemary. You instantly understand. The ivy, with its clinging nature, signifies undying friendship and fidelity, a bond that persists even in death. And the rosemary? That's for remembrance. It's a mainstream historical fact that rosemary was a staple in Victorian funerals, its evergreen nature and strong scent making it a potent symbol of memory. You might even break off a sprig and tuck it into your pocket, a personal memento. Nearby, a stark white lily stands tall in a vase, its trumpet-like bloom almost luminous against the somber backdrop. This flower, universally recognized, speaks of purity and innocence, often chosen when mourning a child or someone who passed away young and untainted. It's a poignant choice, a tear-inducing symbol of a life cut short. You might also spot delicate white roses, signifying reverence and silence, or perhaps a spray of white violets, denoting modesty and faithfulness. These white blooms, in particular, stand out like beacons in the darkness, a visual representation of the soul ascending. But the language isn't always about purity and memory. It's also about the raw, aching sorrow. Darker flowers like the deep purple hyacinth would convey profound grief, while the marigold, with its fiery orange and yellow hues, spoke of despair and jealousy. Perhaps even a hint of regret, though you'd never say it aloud. The cypress and yew, with their somber, needle-like foliage, were almost always present, embodying mourning and sorrow itself. These were not flowers meant to cheer you up. They were floral expressions of the very depths of the human heart, laid bare for all who understood to witness. Think about the subtle nuances. A poppy, for instance, could signify consolation and eternal sleep, a gentle wish for the deceased to find peace. But a red poppy, specifically, might also hint at sacrifice or remembrance of a particular kind of love. It's not just about the type of flower, but its color, its arrangement, even its condition. A drooping bloom might suggest fading hope, while a vibrant, upright one could speak of enduring love. It was a semiotic feast, a silent conversation unfolding around you, and you were expected to be fluent. You couldn't just throw a bunch of random flowers together. That would be like sending a garbled, nonsensical telegram. Imagine trying to apologize with a bouquet of nettles and thistles. Not a good look. This intricate system meant that florists, a burgeoning industry, became incredibly skilled at crafting arrangements that told a specific story. They weren't just selling flowers. They were selling carefully curated messages. You might commission a wreath with a central cluster of pansies, signifying thoughts, surrounded by forget-me-nots, for clear remembrance. Or perhaps a spray of gladiolus, representing the strength of character and sincerity of the departed. The possibilities were endless, provided you knew the code. One quirky tidbit about this floral language is the concept of negative meanings. While many flowers carried positive associations, some, when given in a specific context or combination, could convey displeasure or even a veiled insult. For instance, a yellow carnation could mean disdain, and a striped carnation, rejection. While less common in funeral settings, the very existence of these negative meanings highlights the depth and complexity of the system. It wasn't just about expressing love. It was about expressing anything through petals and leaves. Historians still debate the extent to which everyday Victorians truly mastered this intricate floral lexicon, or if it was more commonly understood in broad strokes, with the very specific meanings reserved for the educated elite or those with a particular interest in botany. It's likely a bit of both. You, as a member of this society, would certainly grasp the general sentiments conveyed by the most common funeral flowers, even if you didn't own a personal copy of the Language of Flowers dictionary, which, by the mid-19th century, were published in countless editions, becoming bestsellers in their own right. The presentation was also key. Funeral wreaths were often grand, circular, symbolizing eternity and the cycle of life and death. They would be placed on or near the coffin, or sent to the bereaved family's home. Sprays and bouquets might be held by mourners or placed strategically around the room. Sometimes, small, individual flowers or sprigs would be laid inside the coffin. A final, intimate farewell. A last whisper of love pressed against the deceased's final resting place. This was not merely aesthetics. It was a deeply symbolic act, sealing the silent message with a physical touch. Contrast this with today, where you simply pick something nice from the florist, perhaps a generic bouquet of roses, without much thought to their specific meaning beyond, they're pretty. For Victorians, it was a profound act of communication, a way to navigate the often unspoken grief that permeated their lives. It allowed mourners to express deep emotions without breaking the strict social decorum that governed public displays of sorrow. You could convey your undying love, your profound sorrow, your hope for peace, all without uttering a single word. The flowers spoke for you, and everyone who mattered understood. So, as you stand there, surrounded by the fragrant, silent eloquence of the flowers, you realize that even in death, the Victorians found a way to maintain their exquisite sense of order and their love for coded messages. Every petal, every leaf, a carefully chosen word in a solemn, beautiful poem of remembrance. It was a public display of private grief, meticulously choreographed down to the very last bloom. And in its own quiet way, it was as impactful as any eulogy. You stand, perhaps, in the hushed, heavily draped parlor of a friend's home, or maybe in a rented room in a bustling city, the gaslight turned down low, casting long, dancing shadows that seem to stretch and writhe with a life of their own. Your breath catches in your throat, a small, involuntary gasp that feels almost sacrilegious in the suffocating silence. The air is thick, not just with the scent of dust and old furniture, but with an almost palpable tension, a desperate, yearning hope that hangs heavy like the velvet curtains. You are here, in this intimate, almost clandestine gathering, because the relentless grip of grief has tightened around your heart, suffocating you, and you are willing to try anything, to find even a fleeting moment of solace. You're ready to step beyond the veil, to peer into the unseen, to listen for the faintest whisper from the other side. In a world where death was an ever-present houseguest, spiritualism offered a radical, yet profoundly comforting, alternative to traditional mourning. While you might have dutifully attended church and sought solace in scripture, the sheer volume of loss, particularly of children, left many feeling a profound, unanswerable void. What if you could speak to them? What if you could receive a sign, a message, a proof that they weren't truly gone? This wasn't just a quirky pastime for the eccentric. It was a deeply serious, often desperate, quest for connection, fueled by an aching heart. It's like when you've accidentally deleted a beloved photo album from your phone, and you're willing to download any dodgy recovery app, no matter how many pop-ups it generates, just to get those memories back. The Victorians, in their own way, were looking for their own kind of data recovery, but for souls. You take your place at a large, polished table, your hands resting lightly upon its surface, fingertips just brushing those of the strangers, or perhaps close acquaintances seated beside you. The medium, often a woman, sits opposite, her eyes perhaps closed, her expression serene yet distant, as if already halfway to another realm. She might be a professional, touring from town to town, or simply a local individual who has discovered a peculiar sensitivity to the other side. The room is quiet, so quiet you can almost hear the dust motes dancing in the faint light. You strain your ears, listening for something, anything, beyond the creaks of the old house settling or the distant sounds of the street outside. Suddenly, a faint tapping. Asterisk tap. Tap tap. Asterisk, it seems to emanate from the table itself, or perhaps from the wall, or even from thin air. Your eyes dart around, searching for a source, but there is none visible. The medium begins to interpret, perhaps asking a question, then waiting for a specific number of taps for yes or no. This, you understand, is the language of the spirits, simple yet profound. Sometimes the table itself might begin to move, rocking gently, or even lifting slightly, as if levitated by unseen hands. You feel a strange tremor run through the wood beneath your palms, a vibration that seems to go right through you, chilling you even as it electrifies your senses. It's an odd feeling, almost like being at a very polite, very slow-motion rave, but instead of glow sticks, you've got, well, ghosts. This phenomenon of table turning became incredibly popular, almost a parlor game in some circles, though for many, it was deadly serious. But the most profound experiences involved direct communication. You might witness the medium entering a trance, their voice changing, taking on the tone and cadence of a departed loved one. Perhaps your mother's voice, clear as day, speaks through the medium's lips, offering words of comfort, reassurance, or even a mundane detail only she would know. Or a disembodied voice might whisper from the shadows, a spectral presence that fills the room. For a brief, terrifying, and utterly exhilarating moment, the veil feels truly thin, almost transparent. The mainstream historical fact here is the pivotal role of the Fox sisters Margaret, Kate, and Leah, who, from their humble beginnings in Hydesville, New York in 1848, popularized the idea of spirit communication through mysterious rappings. Their claims of communicating with a spirit through a series of knocks that answered questions sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, igniting a spiritualist craze that swept through Victorian society like wildfire. Suddenly, the possibility of speaking to the dead wasn't just a mystical notion. It was a demonstrable phenomenon, or so many believed. Beyond the raps and voices, other phenomena might manifest. Perhaps a cold spot passes through you, a sudden drop in temperature that makes the hairs on your arms stand on end. Or objects might move, seemingly on their own. A bell ringing in the corner, a curtain fluttering without a breeze. Some mediums even claim to produce ectoplasm, a mysterious, often gruesome, substance said to be a physical manifestation of spirit energy emerging from their orifices. This quirky, fringe tidbit, often captured in grainy photographs, was meant to be undeniable proof of the spirit world's physical presence, though it frequently resembled little more than cheesecloth or egg whites. Imagine the cleanup after that seance. Then there was automatic writing. The medium's hand, seemingly guided by an unseen force, would begin to scrawl messages on paper, often in a handwriting not their own, sometimes even in a language they didn't consciously know. You might watch, mesmerized, as a pen glides across the page, forming words that seem to be directly from your lost loved one. It offered a tangible, physical artifact of the contact, a message to hold on to reread in the quiet despair of your lonely nights. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in spiritualism was primarily a symptom of mass delusion and clever trickery, or if it genuinely provided a necessary psychological outlet for a society grappling with unprecedented levels of grief. Was it exploitation or a form of self-soothing therapy? The truth, as ever, is likely complex. Many mediums were undoubtedly fraudsters, employing clever sleight of hand, hidden confederates, and prearranged codes to convince their desperate clients. But for those who believed, the comfort was immense, the connection profound. The longing for a sign, any sign, from beyond was so powerful that it often overshadowed any logical skepticism. You wanted to believe with every fiber of your being that your loved one was just a whisper away. The pursuit of spiritual contact wasn't without its costs, both financial and emotional. Seances could be expensive, and the emotional toll of repeated attempts, of hoping against hope, only to be met with silence or inconclusive results, could be devastating. Yet, for many, the brief moments of perceived contact, the fleeting sense of their loved one's presence, were priceless. It offered a temporary reprieve from the crushing weight of finality, a glimmer of light in the profound darkness of Victorian grief. It was, in essence, a desperate attempt to keep the conversation going, even when one party was no longer physically present. A very analog version of leaving comments on someone's old social media profile, perhaps, but with far more dramatic flair. You leave the seance room, your mind buzzing, your emotions a tangled knot of wonder, doubt, and perhaps a fragile sense of peace. Did you truly speak to them? Or was it all a trick of the light, a figment of your own aching desire? The answer may remain elusive, but for a moment, just a moment, you felt their presence, and in the shadow of Victorian grief, that was often enough to keep you going. The yearning to connect with those we've lost is a deeply human impulse, and in a world without the instantaneous communication we know today, Victorians often turned to the unseen, hoping against hope for a sign from beyond the veil. As if the emotional weight of your grief wasn't enough, you soon discover that sorrow, in the Victorian age, came with a surprisingly steep price tag. It wasn't just a feeling. It was an industry, a veritable commercial empire built on the bedrock of loss, ready to cater to your every morning need. whether you knew you had them or not. Imagine, if you will, the gentle hum of commerce, but instead of the usual hustle and bustle, it's a muted, somber drone, echoing through specialized shops designed to outfit you and your entire household in the latest, darkest fashions of despair. You step into one of these establishments, perhaps a grand mourning warehouse in a bustling city like London or Manchester. The air is thick, not with dust, but with the quiet rustle of heavy fabrics and the faint, almost metallic scent of dye. Rows upon rows of black, in every conceivable shade and texture, stretch before you. This isn't just a black. It's jet black, raven black, midnight black, inky black, all waiting to declare your recent tragedy to the world. You learn quickly that there's a distinct hierarchy to these blacks, each whispering a different stage of your bereavement. Your first stop, inevitably, is the crepe counter. A crepe. This isn't your average fabric. It's the undisputed monarch of mourning, especially for widows. You run your fingers over its dull, crinkled surface, feeling its stiffness, its almost abrasive quality. It's a crimped silk gauze, deliberately made without sheen to signify the wearer's utter lack of interest in worldly frivolity. For the first year and a day of deepest mourning, crepe was everywhere. It adorned your bonnets, your veils, your dresses, even your parasols. It wasn't just your heart that was heavy. Your skin probably felt like it was wearing a suit of static electricity, constantly scratching and clinging. And woe betide you if you tried to iron out its signature crimp. That was a social faux pas of epic proportions, signaling a premature desire to shed your grief. Mainstream historical fact. The demand for crepe became so immense that textile mills specialized almost exclusively in its production, churning out miles of the stuff every week to meet the insatiable market. But crepe was just the beginning. You also needed bombazine, a sturdy twilled fabric made from silk and wool, softer than crepe but still resolutely dull. Then there was parramatta, a wool and cotton blend for those who perhaps couldn't afford the silkier options, yet still wished to maintain proper decorum. Every fabric had its place, its specific period of wear. You'd find yourself navigating a veritable textile labyrinth, guided by stern-faced sales assistants who, you suspect, had seen more tears shed over fabric choices than over actual deceased relatives. "Madam, are you sure this bombazine is sufficiently somber for the third month?" You can almost hear them inquire, with a raised eyebrow that conveyed volumes of judgment. Beyond the fabrics, the mourning warehouse offered everything else your grieving heart and social obligations could possibly desire. There were the mourning bonnets, often swathed in vast quantities of crepe, with long, opaque veils that served not only to obscure your face but also to prevent you from seeing much of anything else, which, let's be honest, probably saved you from some awkward social encounters. You'd find gloves, shoes, fans, and even jewelry, jet, onyx, and vulcanite, all in the deepest, most unyielding black. If you thought choosing curtains was hard, try furnishing your entire life in varying shades of midnight. It was a monochromatic marvel, designed to leave no doubt as to your emotional state. Then there was the stationery. Oh, the stationery. Your correspondence, too, had to reflect your sorrow. You'd purchase thick, cream-colored paper edged with a stark black border. The wider the border, the more recent and profound your loss. Matching envelopes, of course, were a must. Imagine the subtle social cues communicated just by the thickness of that black line. A narrow border might suggest, "My aunt died last year and I'm almost over it." A thick one screamed, "My husband just dropped dead, and I'm practically still in shock. Please send casseroles and sympathy." It was a silent language understood by all, a visual shorthand for your current tragedy. But perhaps the most significant development in this booming business of grief was the rise of the professional undertaker. Before the Victorian era, preparing the dead was largely a family affair, or handled by local carpenters who also made coffins, and parish clerks who oversaw burials. Now, you're presented with a dedicated professional, a funeral furnisher, who takes care of everything. They were like the original one-stop shop, except instead of lattes, they offered lamentations. From the moment death darkened your door, the undertaker would step in, a master of ceremonies for your final farewell. They would prepare the body, often laying it out in your own parlor, transforming your living space into a temporary chapel of rest. This involved washing, dressing, and sometimes even rudimentary embalming, a practice that gained traction after the American Civil War and slowly made its way across the Atlantic. They provided the coffin, from simple wooden boxes to ornate, velvet-lined caskets with elaborate silver fittings. They supplied the hearse, a grand, often horse-drawn carriage draped in black plumes, looking for all the world like a Goth parade float. They arranged for the mourning coaches, for you and your family to follow the hearse in solemn procession. They even supplied the black draperies for your front door, the black rosettes for the horses, and the crepe armbands for the male mourners. The undertaker became the orchestrator of the entire funerary spectacle, ensuring every detail adhered to the strict social codes of the time. They'd manage the pallbearers, the flow of guests, and the dignified transport to the cemetery. Their services were not cheap, and their rise marked a significant shift in how death was handled, moving it from the intimate sphere of the home to a commercially managed event. This professionalization of death, while offering convenience, also created a financial burden for many families who felt compelled to put on a respectable, even lavish, display of grief, regardless of their means. It was a true reflection of the era's obsession with appearances. And it wasn't just the big-ticket items. This industry permeated every corner of life. You could buy special mourning fans, mourning stationery cases, even mourning thimbles if you were a seamstress. There were mourning bonbonnières for sweets, and mourning cloaks for evening wear. One quirky or fringe tidbit. Some enterprising individuals even patented mourning jewelry that incorporated tiny, almost imperceptible compartments for holding a lock of the deceased's hair. A truly intimate and portable memento mori that only you would know was there. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of carrying a piece of your loved one so close, yet so secretly. The sheer scale of this commercial enterprise was staggering. Fortunes were made catering to the bereaved. Advertising for mourning goods became commonplace in newspapers, showcasing the latest styles and acceptable materials. You might even find advertisements for mourning warehouses specifically targeting families who needed to outfit an entire household quickly after a sudden death. Historians still argue whether this booming business was a genuine reflection of widespread grief and a desire for dignified remembrance, or if it was an exploitative industry that preyed on vulnerability, creating and reinforcing social pressures to spend exorbitant amounts on outward displays of sorrow. Was it heartfelt tribute or performative consumption? Perhaps it was a bit of both, a complex dance between genuine emotion and societal expectation, all underpinned by the relentless churn of commerce. So, as you drift off, consider the vast, silent machinery of grief that hummed beneath the surface of Victorian society. It was a world where sorrow was not just felt, but meticulously purchased, packaged, and presented, ensuring that your every tear, your every sigh, contributed to the ever-expanding empire of black. As you navigate the treacherous waters of Victorian grief, you quickly learn that mourning isn't just about wearing black or sending condolences. It's a veritable minefield of superstitions and social taboos, a labyrinth where one wrong step could invite further misfortune, or worse, social ostracism. You find yourself constantly on alert, observing not just your own actions, but those of everyone around you, because the Victorians believed that disrespecting the dead or ignoring the subtle whispers of fate could have truly dire consequences. It's like a never-ending game of cosmic Jenga, where pulling out the wrong block means the whole tower comes crashing down on your head. Imagine the moment death finally claims a loved one in your home. Before the tears even fully dry, your instincts, honed by generations of whispered warnings, tell you what must be done. The very first thing? You must immediately open a window in the room where the person passed. Yes, even in the depths of winter, with a biting wind whipping through the house. Why? To allow the soul to escape unhindered, a belief that stretches back centuries. You wouldn't want poor Aunt Mildred's spirit to get stuck in the draperies, would you? That would be terribly awkward for everyone involved. Then, with a solemnity that feels almost theatrical, you or a trusted family member will stop every clock in the house at the precise moment of death. The ticking hands, once marking the relentless march of life, must be frozen in time, commemorating the exact instant the soul departed. To let them continue would be to invite another death, or so the whispers go, ticking away like a morbid countdown. It's a small, quiet gesture, but one heavy with meaning, a silent acknowledgement that time, for the deceased, has ceased. But the most pervasive and visually striking taboo you'd encounter involves mirrors. Almost immediately after a death, every single mirror in the house is covered, usually with a dark cloth. You might use sheets, blankets, or specially made shrouds, transforming reflective surfaces into somber, muted expanses. The reasons for this widespread practice are fascinatingly varied. Some believe it prevents the deceased spirit from becoming trapped within the mirror's reflective surface, forever haunting your living room. Others fear that if a living person sees their own reflection in a room with a corpse, they will be the next to die. It's a bit like a Victorian version of Bloody Mary, but with higher stakes and less fun. This wasn't just a quirky habit. It was a mainstream historical fact, observed rigorously across social strata, from the humblest cottage to the grandest manor. The mirrors remain covered until the body has been removed from the house, a visual manifestation of a household plunged into a temporary, reflective void. The deceased themselves were subject to a litany of rules. You would never leave a body alone before burial, for fear of evil spirits or even worse, the body being taken by nefarious forces. Family members or hired watchers would hold a vigil, often for days, ensuring constant attendance. When the time came for the body to leave the house for burial, it was always carried out feet first. This wasn't just for ease of transport. It was believed to prevent the deceased from looking back into the house, which could tempt another family member to follow them into the afterlife. You wouldn't want Uncle Bartholomew looking over his shoulder and thinking, maybe I left my spectacles in the drawing room, and perhaps I'll just bring Cousin Agatha with me. Even the weather held ominous portents. If a death occurred during a thunderstorm, it was believed the soul would struggle to find rest, forever tossed about by the raging elements. Conversely, a sudden calm or a ray of sunshine breaking through clouds at the moment of death might be seen as a sign of a peaceful passing and a soul swiftly ascending to heaven. You'd find yourself constantly scanning the skies, hoping for good weather on the day of a funeral, not just for comfort, but for the spiritual well-being of the departed. Animals, too, played their part in the grim tapestry of Victorian superstition. A bird flying into the house was a universally ill omen, often signaling an impending death. The howling of a dog at night, especially if directed at a particular house, was another dreaded sign. And if a cat jumped onto the coffin during a wake, well, that was just about the worst luck you could imagine, practically guaranteeing another death in the family. It was enough to make you eye every fluffy feline with a healthy dose of suspicion. Oh, Mittens, you're looking a little too interested in that casket today, aren't you? The very ground you walked on at a cemetery was fraught with peril. You were strictly cautioned never to step over a grave, as it was believed to disturb the deceased and bring bad luck upon yourself. Pointing at a grave was also a major no-no, as it could attract unwanted attention from the spirits residing there. And heaven forbid you ever count the number of carriages in a funeral procession. That was a direct invitation for death to visit your own household next. It's a wonder anyone managed to attend a funeral without constantly tripping over their own feet, trying to avoid stepping on hallowed ground, or nervously biting their tongue to prevent pointing out a particularly ornate tombstone. One quirky or fringe tidbit you might hear whispered about, particularly in more rural areas, was the belief in death tokens or corpse candles. These were phantom lights or sounds, believed to precede an actual death, guiding the soul or warning the living. A flickering light seen outside a house, or a disembodied knocking sound, might send shivers down your spine, interpreted as a supernatural announcement of an impending demise. Historians still argue whether these phenomena were genuine misinterpretations of natural events, vivid hallucinations born of grief and fear, or simply clever ways to explain away the inexplicable in a world without modern scientific understanding. Regardless, they added another layer of apprehension to an already anxiety-ridden time. Even the disposal of personal items was governed by strict rules. You wouldn't simply give away the deceased's clothes or possessions willy-nilly. Often, clothes were burned or given to the poor, but only after a suitable period of time, lest the spirit of the departed cling to them and cause trouble. It was a delicate balance between honoring the dead and ensuring they didn't overstay their welcome in the material world. You certainly wouldn't want to find yourself explaining to your new maid why your late husband's favorite smoking jacket occasionally smells faintly of brimstone and despair. The act of mourning itself, beyond the clothing, had its own set of unwritten rules. It was considered deeply disrespectful to remove mourning clothes before the prescribed period was over, even if you were financially struggling or physically uncomfortable. To do so implied a lack of true grief, a callous disregard for the deceased's memory. You were expected to maintain a somber demeanor, avoiding frivolous entertainment or social gatherings. Laughter, too, was often suppressed in the early stages of mourning, seen as inappropriate and disrespectful to the memory of the lost loved one. It was a time of quiet reflection, enforced by societal expectation and the fear of gossip. Even the most mundane actions could hold hidden perils. If you sneezed during a funeral, it was considered exceptionally bad luck, and you might find yourself quickly making a silent prayer or crossing your fingers for protection. Dropping a coffin was, of course, a catastrophic omen, signaling a second death in the family or community. The undertakers, therefore, were under immense pressure to perform their duties flawlessly, their every move scrutinized by anxious onlookers. The superstitions also extended to the living, particularly children and pregnant women. Often, pregnant women were advised to avoid funerals and cemeteries altogether, lest the close proximity to death negatively impact their unborn child. Children, especially very young ones, were sometimes kept away from wakes and burials, not just for their emotional protection, but also due to the belief that the sight of death might somehow mark them or make them vulnerable to illness. It was a world where vulnerability to death was not just physical, but spiritual, and every precaution was taken to shield those deemed most susceptible. So, as you move through your Victorian life, you are constantly navigating this intricate web of beliefs. Every creak of a floorboard, every bird call, every shadow cast by the setting sun could be interpreted as a sign, a warning, or a message from the other side. It was a life lived under the constant, heavy shadow of mortality, where the rules of the living were deeply intertwined with the perceived rules of the dead, lest you invite further misfortune or disrespect. It's enough to make you want to just stay in bed with the covers pulled up to your chin, isn't it? As you settle deeper into the cushions, perhaps drawing a blanket closer, let's talk about a shadow that loomed larger over Victorian life than any other, a shadow that touched virtually every family: the heartbreaking reality of childhood loss. Today, the loss of a child is, thankfully, a rare and devastating anomaly. But in your Victorian world, it was an all too common, almost expected part of the human experience. Imagine a time where, statistically speaking, you would likely bury at least one of your own children before they reached their first birthday. Indeed, it's a sobering thought, but in the mid-19th century, mainstream historical fact shows that infant mortality rates in England could hover around 150 deaths per 1,000 live births. That's a staggering number, transforming childhood from a period of assumed growth into a precarious tightrope walk. This pervasive reality meant that mourning rituals for children, while distinct, were just as deeply ingrained, perhaps even more poignant, than those for adults. When death visited the nursery, it wasn't the stark, unyielding black of adult mourning that you would reach for. Oh no. For children, particularly infants and very young ones, the color of grief was often pure, innocent white. You'd carefully select tiny white shrouds, often made of fine muslin or silk, sometimes trimmed with delicate lace. The small coffins, too, would be draped in white, or perhaps a soft, pale blue or pink for a baby, rather than the somber black of an adult's. It was a visual representation of their perceived innocence, a belief that they were untainted by the world, returning to God in a state of purity. You might even find yourself choosing a miniature white hearse, drawn by a single white pony, for the final, quiet journey to the cemetery. It was a heartbreaking tableau, a tiny funeral for a tiny life, yet performed with all the solemnity and ritual of a grander occasion. And just when you thought you had the entire adult mourning wardrobe memorized, surprise! Children had their own distinct set of rules. Because, of course, everything had rules. While you, as a mother, would still don your widow's weeds, if the deceased was your child, not your spouse. Your surviving children would wear muted tones of gray, white, or perhaps even lavender for a period, rather than full black. It was a subtle distinction, yet vital, signaling to society the specific nature of the grief within your household. You see, even in sorrow, the Victorians maintained a rigorous social order. The memento mori practices, which we touched upon earlier, took on an especially tender, almost desperate quality when it came to lost children. You would often find yourself carefully clipping a lock of your child's hair, perhaps the only tangible piece of them you had left, to be woven into intricate jewelry. A tiny bracelet, a delicate locket, or even a framed hair wreath that would hang in the parlor, a silent testament to a life too short. These were not merely keepsakes. They were tangible links, a physical connection to the child who was gone, clutched close to your heart. Then there was the quirky, often unsettling practice of post-mortem photography, which was particularly prevalent for deceased children. Imagine this: you would arrange for a photographer to come to your home, where your child, now at peace, would be carefully posed. Sometimes they were made to look as if sleeping, perhaps lying in their crib, or even held in a parent's arms. Other times, their eyes might be propped open, or painted onto the photograph later, making them appear eerily alive. They might be surrounded by their favorite toys, or a beloved doll, creating a poignant, almost surreal, final portrait. It sounds macabre to modern ears, doesn't it? But for Victorians, with no instant cameras or smartphones, this was often the only visual record they would ever possess of their child. It was a way to freeze time, to capture one last precious image before they were laid to rest. It was, in its own way, an act of profound love and a desperate attempt to hold onto a fleeting memory. The funerary rites, though scaled down, were no less meticulous. The parlor, often the heart of domestic life, would transform into a temporary chapel. The tiny coffin would be placed on a draped table, surrounded by flowers, often white lilies or roses, symbolizing purity and innocence. Friends and family would call, offering condolences, their hushed whispers filling the air. For a child, the procession to the cemetery was often quieter, less ostentatious than for an adult, but still a public declaration of loss. The undertaker, ever the master of ceremonies, would ensure every detail, from the size of the coffin handles to the type of floral arrangement, adhered to the prescribed etiquette. One might even quip that the undertakers had a miniature collection going, ensuring even the smallest clients contributed to the booming business of grief. Grave sites for children held their own unique symbolism. You would often see small, sculpted lambs resting atop the headstones, a classic emblem of innocence and sacrifice. Broken flower buds or cherubs with downcast eyes were also common motifs, signifying a life cut short before its prime. These symbols weren't just decorative. They were a silent language, communicating the particular tragedy of a child's death to anyone who walked through the cemetery gates. For parents, the grief was, of course, immense. Historians still debate the true psychological impact of such frequent loss on Victorian parents. Did the sheer commonality of it harden hearts? Or did it simply mean that grief was a constant, unwelcome companion, a dull ache that never truly left? While some contemporary accounts suggest a certain stoicism, born of necessity, it's impossible to truly fathom the depth of sorrow experienced by a mother holding her lifeless infant, or a father burying a child he had hoped would carry on his name. The emotional toll was undoubtedly profound, even if the outward expression was strictly controlled by societal norms. In this era of high mortality, religion often provided the primary solace. You would cling to the belief that your child was now an angel in heaven, safe from the harsh realities of earthly life. Sermons would emphasize the purity of child souls, their immediate ascent to paradise. Hymns would speak of reunion in the afterlife, offering a glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness. This spiritual framework was crucial, providing a narrative that attempted to make sense of the senseless, offering a promise of peace that the physical world could not. The rituals, though seemingly rigid, also served a purpose beyond mere social conformity. They provided a framework for grief, a set of actions to perform when the world felt like it was crumbling. They offered a path through the initial shock and despair, guiding you through the necessary steps of saying goodbye. It's enough to make you wonder if they had a secret society of etiquette ninjas, constantly updating the rulebook for every conceivable life event, including the most heartbreaking. While perhaps stifling in their demands, these rituals ensured that every lost life, no matter how brief, was acknowledged, mourned, and remembered within the intricate tapestry of Victorian society. The quiet, solemn procession of a tiny coffin, the stark white against a world of black, was a powerful, poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the pervasive shadow of death that touched every home. You've endured the crepe, and the crepe. You've felt the suffocating weight of the bombazine and the unyielding rigidity of the whalebone stays beneath layers of black. For years, it has dictated your every public appearance, a constant, visible reminder of your sorrow. But even as you dutifully adhere to the elaborate rituals, a quiet rumble begins to stir beneath the polished surface of Victorian society. You might not hear it loudly at first, perhaps just a whisper among frustrated widows, a grumble from a husband footing the bill, or a sharp critique from a forward-thinking doctor. But slowly, inexorably, the tide begins to turn, challenging the very foundations of this meticulously constructed edifice of grief. Imagine, if you will, the sheer impracticality of it all. You are a busy woman, perhaps managing a household, running a charitable society, or even discreetly dabbling in business. To be perpetually shrouded in black, often heavy and cumbersome, was not just a symbol. It was a physical impediment. Think of the sheer volume of fabric yards upon yards for those billowing skirts, the draped veils, the multiple layers. It was hot in summer, easily stained, and required constant, specialized care. You couldn't just throw it in the wash with your normal linens, could you? No, this was a high-maintenance, demanding wardrobe, and for many, the novelty, if there ever was any, quickly wore off. You might find yourself sighing dramatically as you contemplate yet another trip to the dry cleaner, wishing for the simpler days of, well, any other color. Really, the economic burden, too, was immense. For the wealthy, it was an expense, certainly, but manageable. For the burgeoning middle classes, however, it could be crippling. Imagine losing a spouse and then being faced with the immediate need to purchase an entirely new wardrobe for yourself, your children, and even your servants, all in specific shades and fabrics, often custom-made. It wasn't just the clothes. It was the black-bordered stationery, the special calling cards, the muted jewelry, the funeral accoutrements. It was a veritable industry, as we've discussed, but someone had to pay for it. And that someone was often a family already reeling from loss and potentially a sudden decrease in income. You might find yourself doing a quick mental calculation, realizing that your entire annual budget for new clothes would barely cover a single mourning ensemble. Well, you'd think with a weary sigh, at least I won't need new shoes. Nobody will see them under all this fabric anyway. Beyond the practical and financial considerations, deeper currents of change were at play. The late Victorian era was a time of burgeoning scientific inquiry and a growing interest in psychology. Doctors and early mental health professionals began to question the therapeutic value of such prolonged and public displays of sorrow. Was it truly healthy to remain in such a state of enforced gloom for years? Some argued that it prolonged grief, prevented healing, and isolated individuals when they most needed social connection. You might read an article in a medical journal, perhaps discreetly tucked away from your mother-in-law, suggesting that your black crepe was doing more harm than good, keeping you perpetually in a state of performative sorrow rather than allowing you to process your feelings privately and move forward. Fashion, that ever-fickle mistress, also played a significant role. As the century drew to a close and the new Edwardian era approached, silhouettes began to lighten, loosen, and embrace softer lines. The restrictive, corseted look that lent itself so well to the rigid structure of mourning began to give way to more flowing, less cumbersome styles. The aesthetic movement and later Art Nouveau introduced a palette beyond the somber and a preference for natural forms and less rigid construction. Imagine trying to integrate a voluminous, high-necked bombazine gown into a world that was increasingly favoring slim, elegant dresses with simpler lines. You'd stick out like a sore thumb, or perhaps more accurately, like a very dark, very stiff, and rather out-of-date thumb. There were also specific voices of dissent. Mainstream historical fact alert. One significant figure in challenging the strictures of mourning was Oscar Wilde, who famously quipped, "One must have a heart of stone to read the death of Little Nell without laughing." While this was directed at Dickens' sentimentality, it reflects a broader cultural shift towards questioning excessive emotional display. More directly, some women's rights advocates and dress reformers argued that the restrictive nature of mourning attire, like corsets, was emblematic of the broader societal constraints placed upon women. They championed clothing that allowed for greater freedom of movement and expression, seeing the mandated mourning wardrobe as yet another tool of oppression. You might have seen these rational dress advocates, perhaps scoffing at their lack of decorum, but secretly, a tiny part of you might have envied their freedom to breathe deeply without a corset or to move without dragging yards of fabric behind them. Quirky or fringe tidbit alert. Did you know there were even early anti-mourning societies, or at least vocal advocates for simplification? Some argued for a return to simpler, less ostentatious funerals, believing that the focus should be on spiritual comfort rather than material display. One particularly passionate advocate, a Mrs. E. Lynn Linton, a journalist and novelist, wrote extensively against the tyranny of black, arguing that it was a barbaric custom that inflicted unnecessary hardship and prolonged grief. She even suggested that women should wear white or light colors as a symbol of hope and purity, rather than the dark hues of despair. Imagine proposing that to your grandmother. You'd probably be met with a look that could curdle milk, followed by a lecture on the proper respect for the dead that would last until tea time. The very concept of grief itself began to evolve. While Victorians often viewed grief as a public performance, a testament to one's moral character and depth of feeling, the emerging psychological understanding suggested that grief was a deeply personal, internal process. The idea that one could grieve effectively without a public, years-long display of black was slowly gaining traction. You might find yourself, in a quiet moment, wondering if your own private tears, unseen by society, were not just as valid, or perhaps even more valid, than the carefully orchestrated public performance your crepe-laden wardrobe demanded. Scholarly debate phrase alert. Historians still argue whether the decline of elaborate mourning was primarily driven by economic pressures, changing fashion trends, shifting psychological understanding, or simply the sheer exhaustion of a society that had embraced it so fully. It's likely a complex interplay of all these factors, each chipping away at the rigid structure until it could no longer stand. The final, devastating blow to the elaborate mourning rituals was, perhaps ironically, the very scale of death itself. When World War I erupted in 1914, the sheer, unprecedented loss of life made universal, prolonged mourning utterly impractical, if not impossible. Imagine entire towns draped in black, generation after generation of young men lost, leaving an endless procession of widows, mothers, and sisters in perpetual mourning. The war forced a societal reckoning with grief on a scale no one could have imagined. To maintain the full Victorian mourning protocols would have meant literally drowning a nation in black, bringing daily life to a standstill under the weight of an eternal funeral. How would anyone work? How would the economy function? You couldn't run a factory, nurse the wounded, or even bake bread if everyone was locked in their mourning chambers. Could you? The practicalities of a world at war simply demanded a swifter, more private, and ultimately less visible processing of grief. So gradually the rules loosened. First, the periods of mourning shortened. Then, the intensity of the blacks softened, giving way more quickly to grays, purples, and blues. The heavy crepe disappeared, replaced by lighter fabrics. Veils became shorter, then optional. The elaborate mourning jewelry became sentimental keepsakes rather than daily necessities. You might have found yourself, in the 1920s, looking at your grandmother's old mourning chest, filled with stiff, heavy black garments, and thinking, "My goodness, how did she ever manage?" The world was moving on, and with it, the very definition of how one grieved. The shadow of Victorian grief, while still present, was finally beginning to lift, allowing you and society as a whole to breathe a little easier. You've journeyed through a world where death wore its grief like a tailored suit, where sorrow was a public performance, and every whisper of the reaper's scythe echoed through society's very foundations. But now, as you pull your metaphorical curtains back from the Victorian era, you might wonder, Does any of that meticulously arranged grief still linger in your modern world? Do these echoes of Victorian mourning practices subtly shape your understanding, your very experience of grief and remembrance today? The answer, my dear sleepy listener, is a resounding and slightly spooky yes. While you no longer find yourself donning widow's weeds for years or weaving intricate hair art from departed loved ones, unless you're really into vintage crafts, no judgment here. The invisible threads of Victorian influence still weave through your contemporary customs. Think about it. When someone passes away, what's one of the first things you consider wearing to the funeral? Black, isn't it? That deep, somber hue, once mandatory for years, is now your go-to for a single, solemn day. It's like the Victorians left you a tiny, manageable piece of their dress code. A little fashion memo that simply reads, "Keep it dark, keep it respectful." It's a shorthand for sorrow, a universally understood signal that you are there to mourn, not to audition for a circus. You see, while the strictures have loosened considerably, the idea of a visual cue for grief persists, a silent nod to those who came before you, shrouded in crepe. Consider the funeral industry itself. The Victorians, with their obsession with proper appearances and elaborate send-offs, practically invented the modern undertaking profession. Before them, death care was often a family affair, handled at home with local carpenters for coffins. But as the 19th century progressed, the demand for dignified, professional handling of the deceased grew exponentially. You now rely on funeral directors, embalmers, and morticians, a burgeoning industry that blossomed from the Victorian need for meticulous presentation and solemn efficiency. These professionals ensure the deceased are prepared for viewing, arrange the ceremonies, and transport the body with a decorum that would make a Victorian funeral director swell with pride. It's truly a testament to their entrepreneurial spirit, transforming grief into a booming, if somewhat morbid, business. It's like they thought, if we're going to be sad, we might as well be professionally sad. And what about the way you memorialize? You might not have a morbidly fascinating post-mortem photograph of your great-aunt Mildred propped on the mantelpiece, but you certainly cherish photographs, don't you? Digital photo albums, social media tributes, even physical framed pictures. They all serve a similar purpose to the Victorian memento mori. You keep images of loved ones close, not to remind you of death, but to remember life, to keep their presence vivid. The impulse to hold onto a tangible piece of someone you've lost, whether it's a lock of hair or a digital snapshot, is a deeply human one, amplified and standardized by Victorian practices. You might even find yourself creating a digital memorial page, a kind of virtual cemetery plot where friends and family can leave messages and share memories. It's the modern equivalent of those Victorian mourning cards, just with more emojis and less actual lace. The very language you use around death has been shaped, too. You speak of people having passed away, departed, or gone to their rest. These gentle euphemisms, designed to soften the harsh reality of death, gained widespread currency in the Victorian era. They reflect a desire to make the transition less jarring, less stark, a legacy of a time when death was so omnipresent it required a linguistic velvet glove. You rarely hear someone bluntly state, "He died." Instead, you opt for the softer, more comforting phrases, a verbal inheritance from a time that needed such comforts desperately. It's a linguistic legacy that proves even your words wear a hint of crepe. However, a significant shift has occurred. While the Victorians embraced death as a visible, integrated part of life, you, in your modern world, tend to push it to the margins. Death largely happens behind hospital doors, in hospices, or in the quiet privacy of a home, far from the public eye. The elaborate home wakes, the processions through city streets, the open displays of grief are largely gone. You've professionalized death, sanitized it, and to some extent, hidden it away. Historians still argue whether this shift has made grief easier or harder for individuals, whether the public rituals of the past offered a necessary catharsis that modern privacy denies. It's a complex debate, but certainly, the Victorians would find your reluctance to discuss death openly, your discomfort with its raw reality, quite peculiar. They'd probably wonder why you're so squeamish about something so utterly unavoidable. They might even suggest you need a good dose of arsenic and a spiritualist seance to get over yourself. Yet, some Victorian sensibilities persist in unexpected ways. The idea of a period of mourning, though informal now, still exists. You wouldn't expect someone to throw a huge party the week after a close family member dies. Would you? There's an unspoken understanding, a social grace that dictates a certain period of quiet reflection, a time when you might offer condolences and avoid overly boisterous activities. It's not a year of black crepe, but it's certainly not business as usual. It's a subtle echo of the prescribed stages of Victorian grief, a faint whisper of their insistence on proper decorum. Even your floral tributes, though less laden with specific symbolic meanings than their Victorian counterparts, carry a similar weight. You send flowers to funerals as a gesture of sympathy, a visual expression of sorrow and remembrance. The Victorians, with their intricate language of flowers, would have been able to read an entire obituary from a carefully arranged bouquet. You might not know that a white lily means purity and a red rose means love, but you understand the general sentiment of solace and respect conveyed by a tasteful arrangement. It's a universal language, even if your dialect is less precise than theirs. And what about your comfort objects? Do you have a special blanket, a beloved old sweater, or even a particular mug that brings you solace? While not directly tied to mourning, the Victorian emphasis on tangible keepsakes, on objects imbued with sentimental value, mirrors this human need for comfort and connection through things. They understood the power of an object to hold memory, to soothe a grieving heart. They just took it to an extreme that involved a lot more human hair and less caffeine. So, as you drift towards slumber, reflect on how those long-gone Victorians, with their rigid rules and profound public displays of grief, actually laid some of the groundwork for your own, seemingly casual approach to death. From the clothes you wear to the words you speak, from the professionals you hire to the pictures you cherish, the shadow of Victorian mourning practices stretches subtly into your present. You've shed the heavy veils and the strict timetables, but you still carry a piece of their legacy, a quiet understanding that grief, in its essence, remains a profound human experience, worthy of respect, remembrance, and perhaps a little bit of quiet reflection before you fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. And so, the journey through the secret history of Victorian mourning comes to its gentle close. You've walked through shadowed halls, felt the weight of unseen crepe, and perhaps even imagined the faint scent of lilies and beeswax. It's a world that, for all its strictures, understood the deep, aching need to honor those who had departed, to mark their passing with dignity and devotion. As your mind begins to quiet and your breath grows soft and even, let the images of intricate hair jewelry and solemn processions fade like old photographs. The echoes of their grief, though distant, remind you of the enduring human heart, always seeking ways to cope with loss, always finding solace in ritual. Even if those rituals evolve with time, allow the quiet hum of your own thoughts to become a lullaby, a gentle reminder that even in history's most somber corners, there is a profound beauty in remembrance. As you drift further, let yourself be enveloped by a sense of peace, knowing that the past, in its own way, has prepared you for the quiet moments of the present. All the stories, all the echoes, now softly recede, leaving only the calm embrace of the night.